Okay, so let me begin with something that should alarm you but probably won't, because the news cycle has already moved on. According to Iranian state television, the United States and Iran are negotiating a memorandum of understanding, brokered by Pakistan, that would fundamentally reshape who controls one of the world's most strategically consequential pieces of geography. And I want you to understand something. This is not a ceasefire agreement. This is a power transfer. Let me be transparent with you about what we are actually looking at here. I am Professor Jiang, and this channel exists to decode power shifts before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in because this one gets worse the deeper you go. Let me start with the basic facts. The draft memorandum calls for three things. First, the United States lifts its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Second, U.S. military forces withdraw from what Iran calls the vicinity of Iran. And third, Iran reopens the Strait of Hormuz and ensures that maritime traffic returns to pre-war levels within 1 month. On the surface, this looks like a reasonable trade. Both sides get something they desperately need. America gets energy prices to stabilize before the November elections. Iran gets to export oil again and escape economic strangulation. But here is where it gets very interesting. The monitoring and control of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz would be handled by Iran working with Oman, not by international bodies, not by neutral arbiters. Iran and Oman. Think about what this means. The Strait of Hormuz is not some minor waterway. 1/5 of the world's crude oil flows through it. 1/5. That is roughly 21 million barrels per day. It is the arteries of the global economy. And according to this draft framework, those arteries are now under partial Iranian sovereignty. Let me take you back to understand why this matters so profoundly. For decades, American naval supremacy in the Persian Gulf was treated as a law of nature. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain. 11 aircraft carrier strike groups capable of projecting power across the region. An architecture of military bases, forward deployed assets, and implicit threat. This was not accidental. This was the foundation of American hegemony in the Middle East. Control the Strait of Hormuz, and you control global energy flows. Control global energy flows, and you control the price of oil. Control the price of oil, and you influence the stability of every economy on Earth. Now let me address something directly. The United States did not lose this position through military defeat. America still has the most powerful navy in the world. The U.S. still has more aircraft carriers than any other nation. What happened is different and more instructive. America chose to prioritize the urgent over the important. Energy prices were spiking. Global food security was collapsing because fertilizer shipments could not move. Hundreds of thousands of people were at risk of starvation in the global south. And so the Trump administration, facing political pressure and genuine humanitarian crisis, made a decision: reopen the Strait of Hormuz now, negotiate the nuclear question later. This is what strategists call the Malacca dilemma, named after the Malacca Strait between Malaysia and Indonesia. It refers to the vulnerability of any nation whose survival depends on the free passage of resources through a choke point it does not control. For decades, China lived with this dilemma. Chinese oil tankers dependent on passage through straits controlled by the U.S. Navy. And so China spent 30 years building alternative routes, investing in pipelines through Central Asia and Russia, developing naval capacity to challenge American dominance. The United States watched this happen and did very little to prevent it. Now the U.S. is about to hand Iran the same strategic leverage that the Americans spent decades denying to Beijing. Let me dwell on the mechanics of this agreement for a moment. The draft framework says the U.S. will withdraw from the vicinity of Iran. What does vicinity mean? Iran has historically interpreted this to mean the entire Middle East. The U.S. will certainly not accept that. So there is enormous ambiguity built into this text. But here is what matters. Pakistan is mediating. Pakistan, not the United Nations, not a neutral third party. Pakistan, a nation with deep ties to Iran, a nation that has its own strategic interests in seeing American power diminished in the region. Vice President J.D. Vance is involved. Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are at the table. But the decision ultimately rests with Trump himself. And Trump has already signaled what he wants. No highly enriched uranium in Iran. The nuclear program essentially ended. But Iran has pushed the nuclear question off to a later phase of negotiations, 60 days of negotiations, to be precise. Now I want you to think about the asymmetry here. America gets a temporary reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran gets permanent control over monitoring and regulating traffic through it. One is reversible, one is not. Once Iran and Oman establish the infrastructure, the precedent, the operational capacity to control maritime traffic, it will be extraordinarily difficult for any future American administration to undo it. This is not a ceasefire. This is a fait accompli dressed up as a negotiation. Let me ask you a question. Why Pakistan? Why not France? Why not Germany? Why not the United Nations? Why Pakistan specifically? Because Pakistan sits at the intersection of American, Chinese, and Iranian interests. Because Pakistan has leverage with all three. Because Pakistan understands that the world is shifting from American unipolarity to competitive multipolarity. And because Pakistan, like many nations in the global south, has decided that the future belongs to those who can navigate between great powers, not to those who choose sides. Okay? Let me now address the nuclear question, because this is where the framework reveals its true nature. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, took 2.5 years of arduous negotiation to reach, and it was built on mutual political will, on the assumption that both sides wanted a mutually beneficial agreement. What we have now is different. The US and Iran are not negotiating from a position of mutual trust. They are negotiating from a position of exhaustion. Iran is exhausted by sanctions. America is exhausted by the cost of maintaining military dominance in the region. And so they are kicking the nuclear question down the road. 60 days to reopen the strait. Months or years to negotiate the nuclear program. This buys time, but time favors Iran. Why? Because Iran is a rising power in the region, and time is the ally of rising powers. Every month that passes, Iranian capabilities improve. Every month that passes, the US becomes more dependent on Iranian cooperation to maintain energy prices. Every month that passes, the precedent of Iranian control over the strait becomes more entrenched. This is what I mean when I say the framework prioritizes the urgent over the important. It solves an immediate problem by creating a much larger, long-term problem. Now, I want to be clear. I am not saying that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is a bad idea. The humanitarian stakes are real. Hundreds of thousands of people could starve if fertilizer, helium, and urea cannot move. Energy prices are destabilizing global markets. These are not minor considerations. But there are ways to reopen the strait that do not hand Iran permanent control over it. There are international mechanisms, neutral arbiters, multilateral frameworks that could have been deployed. Instead, the US chose the fastest route, which happens to be the most costly route in strategic terms. Let me bring in one more piece of this puzzle. The draft agreement specifies that hostile vessels, meaning US and Israeli ships, would still be blocked from the strait. But the UAE, despite tensions with Iran, would not be classified as hostile. Neither would Saudi Arabia, nor Kuwait, nor Qatar. So we have a situation where Iran gets to define which nations are hostile and which are not. This is not neutral regulation. This is Iranian sovereignty over a global choke point. Okay? Here is the synthesis. What we are watching is the slow erosion of American hegemony in the Middle East, not through military defeat, but through the accumulation of strategic concessions. Each concession seems reasonable in isolation. Reopen the strait to prevent starvation. Negotiate the nuclear question later. Withdraw from the vicinity of Iran, however that is defined. But together, they constitute a fundamental shift in the balance of power. 20% of global oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and that 20% is now, for practical purposes, under Iranian control. This is not prophecy. This is structural analysis. If this pattern continues, the most likely outcome is that the US loses the ability to use the strait as a lever of economic coercion. And once you lose that lever, you lose the ability to shape regional politics. And once you lose that ability, you lose the ability to maintain the architecture of American dominance in the Middle East. That architecture has been cracking for years. This agreement accelerates the crack. The question now is what comes next. Does the US accept a multipolar Middle East where Iran is one of several regional powers? Does it try to rebuild its position through military means, which would be extraordinarily costly and probably futile? Does it pivot entirely to Asia, abandoning the Middle East to Chinese and Iranian influence? These are the questions that matter. And they are not being asked in Washington because Washington is focused on November elections and energy prices. I want you to question everything I'm saying. Check the facts. Look at the draft memorandum yourself. Think about the incentive structures. Think about what each actor actually wants, not what they say they want. And then ask yourself, if Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, what does that mean for the dollar system? What does it mean for American geopolitical leverage? What does it mean for the next decade of global politics? I'm Professor Jiang. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that the most consequential geopolitical shifts often happen quietly, reported by Iranian state television, while the world is looking elsewhere.